human development for educators, spiritual life cycle, adolescent development, and teens in and out of crisis. She also teaches a parent-child class in her synagogue, Temple Sinai of Stamford, which is a monthly text-based class for 6th and 7th graders and their parents. Betsy also teaches webinars and seminars on topics ranging from a series of national webinars on 13 Reasons Why, to adolescent spirituality, to Gen Xers as parents and teen brains and stress. She's an engaging speaker whose passion for the lives of teens and their parents has brought her invitations to teach all over the US. She has worked with the Jewish Education Project in New York on multiple webinars and live teaching opportunities, including trips to Broadway shows, character strengths, and bullying. And during the COVID-19 crisis, Betsy has led webinars for congregations, rabbis, Hillels, Hebrew Union College, and the Jewish Education Project. And I can also say from personal experience, I've had the chance to learn with Betsy on webinars in the past, and she's truly wonderful, and we're blessed to have her here. So I will turn everything over to her now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I hate the introduction part. I wish I could go away from that part. So I have a request. I am quite convinced that the best part of teaching is making sure that I'm giving you what you want. So unlike lots of people, I really like to be interrupted. I really like questions. I don't think it's rude. I think it's engaged. And so I want to ask you to ask me questions. My husband says that there are times that I lapse out of English into psychology. And so if I lapse out of English, or if I say something you want to question me about, or argue with me, or make me explain, please do. This is your time, and I want to make sure it's useful for you. This is what I'm thinking we're going to do tonight, but I love tangents, and if you take us down a tangent that isn't in my plan, then we'll go down that tangent. I think what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start by talking about what trauma is. And I think that's really important, because I think it's important for us to understand that what we're experiencing right now is utterly normal in an absolutely abnormal time. So I want to talk about trauma, both what it is and what it does in our brains. I want to talk a little bit about what helps ameliorate trauma. And then I want to talk about forms of wellness. This is that, in fact, we tend to think about health as the absence of illness, and I actually want to think about health as the presence of health, which is actually a very different orientation, and one which for me makes a lot of sense. And then potentially talk about some of the things that come out of trauma that are in the category, psychological category, of post-traumatic growth. That not all trauma leads to post-traumatic stress disorder, but that there is real trauma that leads to growth. And a part of our agenda, as we think about the times that we find ourselves in right now, is to think about growth and how we're gonna facilitate growth, how we're gonna support growth. So that's my goal. If we make it through, I'll be happy. If we don't make it through because you've distracted us, I'll also be happy. So make sure that you're getting what you need. So I'm going to start by doing something that I don't generally love to do, which is to screen share, and to ask and simply to look at this definition of trauma. This is a psychological definition of trauma, not a psychiatric definition of trauma. They are actually different, which I think is fascinating. So here's our definition, and it has 5 components. I'm going to want to talk about each of the 5 components. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel the full range of emotion and experiences. So that's 5 components. The first one, trauma is the response to an event. In fact, trauma is one of these things. One of the things we need to understand about trauma is that it's real. That this is not like I woke up in a bad mood and I'm therefore, kind of nasty all day long, but that there is something actually real that is happening and I am responding to it. I actually think this is a really important aspect of it, particularly for women, because women most of us have spent time in our lifetimes being told that we are overreactive or oversensitive or all sorts of other words which undercut the emotional reality of experiencing my own life. So this is not one of these things that somebody can take away by telling you you're feeling too much. It's real. And let's start by knowing that trauma is a response to something real. So that's number one. It's an event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. One of the interesting things about coping is that we all have routine coping mechanisms that we fall back on a regular basis. And you know what your coping mechanisms are. They may be that you eat more sugar. It may be that you drink more. It may be that you exercise more. It may be that you sleep more. It may be that you fight with your partner more. These are all coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are not de facto positive. And in fact, what most of us do when our coping mechanisms don't work is we just do them more. So that when the scoop of ice cream doesn't make me feel better, maybe the pint of ice cream will make me feel better. In fact, when our coping mechanisms are not working, they generally, doing them more doesn't generally work, but that is something that human beings do kind of naturally. The way I like to think about this is it's, when a 3-year-old says to you, I want a cookie, and you say no, they don't say, oh, that's fine. They say, I want a cookie louder. And then they say it louder again, because they don't have a strategy. And coping mechanisms generally happen at a level at which we're not being strategic. So that instead of saying what the 3-year-old could say that would be very sensible is, if I have an applesauce pouch, may I then have a cookie, right? If I have something healthy, can I then have this? They don't do that. They just escalate, and that's what we do with our coping mechanisms. That was number 2. Number 3, causes feelings of helplessness. Well, I think that in the trifecta of COVID, race relations, and the election, helplessness is part of what we're all experiencing. But feelings of helplessness are, for many of us, at this point in our lives, almost a new experience, that I've never felt like my behavior was less functional, less important, less impactful, because our lives have gotten so much more narrow in many ways, that these feelings of helplessness are a whole new experience of myself in the world. Instead of being a person who sees herself as an actor who can make things happen, what am I supposed to do now? I'm supposed to stay home. That's really a shift in myself, in my sense of self. And that leads us to the 4th one, diminishes their sense of self. Our sense of self is interesting because it doesn't have to be valid. It doesn't have to be true for it to be something I believe about myself. So for example, I grew up I'm almost 5'3". I grew up in a family with 2 sisters who were 5'8" and 5'9", and I grew up thinking I was incredibly short. There were many things in the kitchen cabinets I could not reach that everybody else in my family could reach. I got to college, and I suddenly realized I'm actually the height of an average American woman. But my sense of self was that I was short. And if you had said to me, tell us something interesting about you, I would have said I'm a really short person. I'm not. So my sense of self isn't dependent on reality. It's dependent on the stories I tell myself about myself. Some of those are externally generated. Some of those are internally generated. When my sense of self is diminished, I experience myself as less of a resource to myself. So for example, if I said to myself pre-COVID, I'm a person who's a participator, and then said to myself in COVID, I need to stay home. there's the shift in who I am and what I can do. So I find I'm over 60, so I'm in that category where you're not supposed to do stuff. And I find myself offering to do things and then having my husband say to me, no, you're not going to do that. Because there are things that I would, of course, always have offered to do, but really now they don't fit in with what I should do, can do, and it changes my relationship actually with myself. And the fifth, it diminishes our ability to feel the full range of emotion and experience. So what happens under trauma for all of us is that we regress. We regress in ways which are very similar to the ways that small children regress. We are more emotional. We lose some of our skill. There's really kind of three ways in which people regress. We get more emotional, whether that's greater anger or weepiness or whatever. We get clingy, and we lose skills. And I think a lot of us experienced that more at different times in COVID. So for example, I think at the beginning, the first couple weeks, most of us were numb. Just like, what is happening around me? And that as the numb wore off, some of us got despairing, some of us got energized, but the numb comes back, goes and comes and goes and comes. And the emotional reactivity, I think, has been there for lots of people throughout. So I'm going to stop sharing this because I'd rather see all your faces. What happens because of trauma, what happens in our brains because of trauma is really interesting. So think of your brain as being more primitive in the back and more sophisticated in the front. That's a gross oversimplification, but it works. What's happening in the back of our brains is all self-protection. And what's happening in the front of our brains is a lot of thinking. Thinking is not as helpful when you're in trauma, because what our bodies are geared to do or designed to do in trauma is to keep us safe. That's their job. Our brains are supposed to keep us safe. So what our brains do is we sleep less deeply because we're looking out for danger, right? We are more reactive because we're looking out for danger. We don't think things through as clearly because we're looking out for danger. And so because the more primitive part of our brain is saying, watch out, watch out, watch out, something bad could happen, all sorts of other parts of our brains and bodies are compromised. So I don't know about you, but I spend more time awake in the middle of the night than I ever have. And I wake up and I think to myself, oh, I have an hour and a half before I will fall back to sleep. Well, this has now become normal enough that it doesn't piss me off the way it used to. And I don't sit there in bed going, oh God, I'll never sleep again. I literally look at the clock and think, okay, in an hour and a half, I'll go back to sleep. That's part of a trauma response. That's part of a COVID response, or an election response, or a race relations response, or a loss response. Because a lot of what we're experiencing is the equivalent of grief. And people actually, sleep disturbance is actually a part of grief that we all experience. So there are all these components so we have this definition of trauma, which has these 5 different components, but then it gets manifest in us in different ways. So I am a big reader. The first couple weeks after September 11th, I lived relatively near to New York City. I couldn't read at all. And I just couldn't read. I couldn't pick up a book. I couldn't pick up a newspaper. I couldn't read. That hasn't happened to me in COVID, but I'm also a big knitter, and I couldn't knit for the first month of COVID. These are things that normally give me comfort, but I actually didn't have the brain waves, the concentration to be able to do them. So my guess is that you also had things that didn't work for you that you would normally have thought worked for you, not just sleep. And And I want to take a minute. I want to ask you if you have questions for me thus far, but I also want you to go into the chat box for just a second. Don't reveal anything that you're not comfortable revealing, and say something, share something, some way in which you got unbalanced or still are unbalanced as a result of what I keep calling the trifecta. So if you don't mind, go into the chat box and share something. The reason I want you to do this is because every single one of you is having these kinds of experiences, and it's really important that you understand that they're normal. The bad dreams have to do with the fact that you're not dreaming more, although lots of people think that they're dreaming more. You're actually just not dreaming as deeply, and so you're much more likely to wake up. It's not that we dream more; it's that we dream. It's that our sleep is so much more shallow than it normally is. Fatigue is a part of grief. And it is a natural part of grief. It's actually one of the measures of grief is is how tired we are. I find that I'm achy, not just tired, but achy. And there are times that and of course, because we're also not just achy, we're also paranoid. I wake up in the morning or during the day and I say to myself, oh my God, my back hurts. Oh, I must be sick. I must be dying, right? So it's then we not only have the physical symptoms, but then we have these kind of rocks rolling down a hill of, going down a bad spiral of even worse stuff. Things overwhelm us that didn't normally overwhelm us. I would call this less elasticity, that none of us are as our ability to recover is so much more limited. Hannah, when you can't write songs, what you're saying is, I can't process what's happening to me. And I'm sure that the writing songs and writing music is a way that you take your insides out, and you can't do that because your insides are so confusing, right?
Yes, normally it's my most expressive, like my most easy way to express what I'm going through, and it became the opposite, and that was very confusing to me.
Right, because you don't have access to Hannah the way you normally have access to Hannah. Muscles are tight, so there's been some research that says that people are breaking teeth at a higher rate than ever before. Breaking teeth, and yeah, so I have actually found myself noticing how much of the time my teeth are touching, because normally your teeth don't touch. If you're just sitting normally, like if you're watching television or reading a book or having a conversation, your teeth should not be touching. How many of you, now that I've said that, notice that your teeth are touching each other? See, and when you relax your face, you'll say to yourself, oh yeah, my teeth are not supposed to be touching, but your teeth are always touching now because we're just so tense. We're so tightly wound. Another piece of this is that we are spending more time with the people we love or live with than we have ever spent with them. You have never been with your partner, with your children, with your in-laws, with your roommate as much as you are right now. And that is actually a really interesting aspect of this. We do know that there's been a significant increase in divorce filings. I don't think that's terribly surprising. But even those of us who are in happy relationships are spending a whole lot more time than we're used to spending with our roommates, for want of a better word. And what that means is that we're actually getting to know people more deeply and with kind of more exposure, more friction potentially than we ever have. than we ever intended to. I mean, even when you think about going away on vacation with your family and we say, oh, I just want to be together, we schedule a lot of stuff to do. We structure the time. There's a lot of unstructured time where we're kind of bouncing off the walls. And in fact, in spaces that are smaller than we're used to. So whether or not your partner is home and you're used to them not being home, or your kids are home, there's an article in the New York Times last week, which I will happily send to Annie if anybody wants, that's basically saying that the parents of young children are as overwhelmed as they have ever been. That this is infinitely harder than having a newborn in the house, which is damn hard. And it is because we have no experience with this. We don't know what we're doing and how to do this. So there's this whole cascade of experiences that come out of this trauma that are making us feel unsure and uncomfortable and disconnected. And I think one of the most important things that Alana, you can't even go outside. That one of the most important things that we can give to each other right now is the understanding that that what you're experiencing is actually normal. That the sleep disruption, the clenched jaw, the aching back, the drinking more than you normally drink. There was in the first month of COVID. Now remember, this number is partly because people weren't eating in restaurants and going to bars, but there was a 40% increase in retail liquor sales. Wow. That's a huge increase. Even if it's only a 20% increase in retail liquor sales, that's a huge increase. We were, as a people, not just Jews, we were drinking more, we were eating more, we were fighting more, we were sleeping worse. All those things are normal. And so stop beating yourself up about them. Questions before I move on to what do we do?
I have a question, Betsy. It's
Kelly. Kelly, you win. No, Hannah won the Bravery Award. You win the Bravery Award.
Hannah usually wins the Bravery Award. That is true.
Yes.
So I have a question about, often when we think about trauma, we think about a specific, like, traumatic event. And I think what is different about this is that it's not a specific traumatic event. It is an ongoing process of trauma. And I'm wondering how that is different in terms of how people are responding to it, or kind of what that does to your brain to be in sustained trauma.
Okay, so two things. One is what it does is it gives you no recovery time, right? What we normally do when there's an event that is difficult is we actually have time to recover. For example, that's kind of what Shiva is supposed to be. It's supposed to be time to remember that you're alive and that you're connected to other people. It's not long enough. It feels very long, but it's not long enough in terms of that reconnection. But we have rituals and ways to respond when we can say, and that's over. Part of the difficulty here is that we have no sense of when this will be over. When we went into lockdown in Connecticut, and we went into lockdown before you did in Georgia, I wrote an email to a whole bunch of people who were coming to my house for Seder, and said to them, I just want you to know that there's this thing that's called Pesach Sheni, which happens a month after Passover. And if you can't celebrate Passover on the day it's supposed to be, you can always celebrate on Pesach Sheni. So I'll see you then. Like, what was I thinking? Well, I was thinking this was going to last a month. Alana, I'm gonna come to that in just a second. It's a great question. The endlessness of this both gives us, both adds to the pressure and and adds to the passivity, because again, there's not much I can do. This feeling of helplessness is exacerbated by the sense of endlessness. The other piece of this that is important for us to understand is that most trauma is more often than not personal rather than communal. So the fires in California are communal trauma, but most trauma is personal. And what we assume is then that I can describe my trauma to you, I can tell you about my trauma, you're going to listen to me talk about my trauma, because my trauma is not pulling up your trauma. But one of the interesting things that's happening now is that my trauma pulls up your trauma. And so if I want to talk to you about how I'm suffering, it's really hard for you to listen to that without thinking about how you're suffering. And new trauma pulls up old trauma. So one of the interesting distinctions in response to Rabbi Perry's question between kids and adults is that what the kids' experience is today, but my experience is of this trauma and other traumas I've experienced. So I will tell you that at the beginning of the lockdown, what my awful dreams were about a previous trauma that I basically thought I had resolved. Because what the pathway in our brain just gets activated. And so today's trauma pulls up yesterday's trauma and the trauma of 6 months ago, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't happen as much for children, small children. Small children are much more in the here and now. And with the exception of issues when somebody in the family has died, and then we're in a different kind of category. I look at my 5, 7, and 7-year-old granddaughters. They're having a much easier time than their parents. Much easier time than their parents. And I think that it's because they don't have enough of a comparison. We have a huge comparison. The trauma responses in kids are variations on the trauma responses in adults. So emotional reactivity, clinginess, and loss of skills. We see that's really what human beings do when we're under this level of stress. And so we're going to see kids who need to be retoileted and kids who are having more tantrums and stuff like that. That's kind of normal. And it's, with the exception of needing new toilet training, it's what we're doing as well, right? So we may be weepier and we may be emotionally flatter and we may be watching worse television than we normally watch. You know, it's the same stuff. We're all kind of needing nurturing and needing to be cared for in both, and a lot of that we look to other people outside of us for it. I do want to mention something that Erica's comment makes me think about, which is there's an awful lot of competition and comparison in the way that we respond to this. Are you taking your children to? Are you going to the grocery store? Are you eating in restaurants? There is so much judgment that is just free floating all around us. So that even if I'm engaged in a conversation with a friend about what we're doing, she may be doing things that I'm unwilling to do or vice versa. And there is a lot of finger shaking that's happening between us, which I would just suggest to you that the best thing to do about that is to avoid doing it. You know, we each have to make our own decisions. And I think that's part of what's so hard about this, is that we don't really have clear guidance about what is going to keep us safe and keep the people around us safe. And some of that it comes from lots of different sources. How about that for being politically correct? So I want to, Nikki, there are different kinds of trauma. they are often, the shift is often has to do with the amount of actual direct harm that you've experienced. But it also has to do with how much trauma you've experienced in the past. One of the things we know, for example, is that soldiers returning from war zones, that we can actually predict, not perfectly, who's more likely to get PTSD and who's less likely to get PTSD. And it has to do with all sorts of other skills and experiences that people have had. There are shifts. And Sophie, I think that actually that some of the anxiety in kids is caught anxiety. I think that parents who are calmer actually have kids who are calmer, and parents who are more anxious have kids who are more anxious. They're probably also hardwired that way. That I'm not trying to say that kids aren't worried. There is no question that kids are worried. But I am trying to say that kids aren't, they're not getting the old trauma on top of the new trauma. They're just in the present much more. Does that help, Sophie? Okay. So what helps ameliorate this? Leo, I know you want to talk about teens, and okay, actually I want to stop for a second before I do this. LGBTQ teens are traumatized already. They're being LGBTQ in our culture is an ongoing trauma. Let's be clear about that, that even the kids who are doing the best have to come out every single time they want somebody to understand who they are, so that the experience of coming out is one that is repeated over and over for them, and that is effectively, that becomes traumatic for kids. That every single time you have to say, no, this is who I am, no, this is who I am, is the repetition of the experience, the initial experience. I think that the LGBTQ community, when it works well, and hopefully it's working well in Atlanta, gives kids enough of a net that they have places to go. But I think there are lots of ways in which we are really missing that net, that part of the net is in the casual, meaningless encounters that are incredibly important for us to feel seen and heard. Whether it is walking out of a class with somebody and saying, I hate that damn teacher, that's actually a way in which I say to you, we are together, we have joint experiences. And I think that many of us are really missing that sense of being connected to other people, not just physically, but psychologically. I have begun saying to people at the end of Zoom meetings like this, I'm going to get off, but you should stay on. Because in fact, when Hannah says to Erin, hi, Erin, that's actually a part of that net that is really important for us in terms of simply feeling connected to other human beings. The skin stuff is also very important. Okay, so it seems to me that the stuff that helps ameliorate trauma. First of all, we're going to still be in trauma after this whole thing is resolved. And if tomorrow there was a vaccine and everybody took it and it was in the water system and you had no choice and you knew you were safe, you would still be experiencing the after effects of trauma. It doesn't go away just because the situation is improved. What really helps with trauma is a couple of kind of pretty obvious things: social and emotional learning stuff, modeling feelings, labeling feelings, the patience. I actually think that one of the things that we do that it can be really helpful with smaller kids, and that teenagers are willing to do if you get them in the right silly state of mind, is to practice our feelings. So for example, you can sing the alphabet I promise I won't do this to you. I have a terrible voice. But you can sing the alphabet in an angry voice, or you can sing the alphabet in a silly voice, or you can sing the alphabet in a happy voice. And all of those are ways in which we say to people, you have emotions, let's label them, let's practice them. I actually think that Sophie, for 5-year-olds, practicing emotion, one of the things we do a lot with little kids is we label emotions, but I actually think practicing emotions is more important, because it's one thing for me to say to you, I feel tired. It's another thing for me to show you I feel tired. It's one thing for me to say to you, I'm scared. It's another thing for me to go, I'm scared. And I actually think the physical aspect of labeling feelings and practicing feelings is actually really important. So, you know, if I had kids, with little kids, I would be stomping around the house, doing my ABCs like I'm really angry, because I think it actually helps us understand what that feeling is like. Honestly, I think one of the things that is really useful for all of us is breathing, and in the same category as we're all clenching our jaws, very few of us are actually breathing all that well. One of my kids, who is a school teacher, starts every class with a breathing exercise, and she says to the kids, I know you think this is stupid, but have any of you been breathing the rest of the day? And they kind of nod their heads. We're not breathing right. We're not breathing into our bellies. I think breathing is actually incredibly important. I think another way in which we are helpful to kids is when we say, I need self-care, and talk about the ways in which we do self-care, but not by telling them what they should be doing. How many people have told you in the last 6 months that you need to be doing yoga? Okay, now there are lots of people who love yoga, but if you're a person who doesn't love yoga, or meditation, or exercise, or making sourdough bread, there are all these things we've started doing that we are telling other people they should do. Don't make people feel badly because they're not doing yoga. Actually, it's much more useful to say to people, what are you doing, rather than saying this is what you ought to do. And if what you're doing is eating a lot of ice cream, if it's helping, I just don't think there's a problem with that, unless you're diabetic. I mean, you can eat a lot of ice cream, because we need to do things that are self-care. I actually think that one of the most important forms of self-care is in the acknowledgement of self-care. So I love to shower. I don't know why. I love to shower. I like water a lot. And I have started saying to myself, don't take a shower to get clean. Take a shower to take a shower. And if I add 2 minutes to the length of my shower, or 5 minutes to the length of my shower, it both helps, and because I said to myself, I'm worth doing this for, that helps. So there's 2 layers there of self-care. One is doing it, and the other is saying, I'm worth doing it for. I think that a lot of what we're telling people about self-care is just making them feel worse, rather than making them feel better. And so, like, what's the point of that? So, questions thus far, or I'm going to go into a wellness model with you. I'm definitely not getting everything in. Tell me whether or not you'd rather talk about wellness, or you'd rather talk about post-traumatic growth. So wellness, raise your hand. Post-traumatic growth, raise your hand. Okay, we're doing post-traumatic growth. So we know that all of us, that trauma has the real potential to make us grow and develop and have kind of a deeper sense of self and of myself in the world. That's the best outcome of trauma. Now, I don't think trauma is avoidable over the course of our lifetime, but we either take trauma and build on it, or we take trauma and it becomes cement shoes for us. And those are there really aren't very many other options, right? So trauma either makes me stuck, or it allows me to grow and learn new things. We absolutely know that there are significant upsides that people can experience as a result of trauma. Trauma deepens our relationships. Most of us who are experiencing trauma are actually able to make different kinds of connections with people. One of the things I have been saying really since the beginning of this is, when you feel bad, pick up the phone and call somebody. Because your act of generosity in calling somebody, I'm not saying call somebody and saying I feel like shit, although you can do that. But the act of generosity that's involved in picking up the phone and calling somebody actually will make your anxiety and stress diminish. And we know that acts of generosity serve the doer as much as they serve the receiver. This is actually something that's, I think, very useful for adolescents to understand, that when you feel bad, doing for somebody else will make you feel better. And as opposed to when you feel bad, receiving more will make you feel better, because it often doesn't. So one of the things we see as a result of trauma is a deepening and strengthening and greater appreciation of relationships. Another thing we see as an upside ultimately that comes out of adversity is a greater appreciation of life writ large. I think that this is going to be, I have no question, that this is going to be the trauma of this generation, in the same way that the Second World War was the trauma for an earlier generation. I think most generations are actually marked by the bad things that happen during that time, rather than the good things that happen. I think we're going to be a different people when this is all said and done, because I think we're going to have developed a greater appreciation for life and relationships. We also see that people who are recovering from adversity often have an increased compassion and altruism. I think we absolutely have seen that in the response to George Floyd's murder, that because we're all living kind of towards the edge of a cliff, those events got more response than I Can't Breathe in New York City. What we're seeing is that as a culture, we're not only individually more reactive, but we're also culturally more reactive. I don't know that that's a bad thing at all. I think that those are things that may actually shift us in positive directions, because we are less stuck in the status quo, and because part of what we see in response to this kind of communal trauma is increased altruism. We're also seeing that in the California fires, right? That people take care of each other. One of the weirdest things about COVID, of course, is that we can't bring people into our homes in the way that we might have otherwise done. So this hurricane that swept up the East Coast, where I have extra bedrooms because my children have moved out, I would have had friends sleeping in those extra bedrooms who didn't have power. I couldn't do that. And so there is this kind of push me, pull you about altruism that I think also existed for lots of us in terms of the marches, the race relations marches. I think that for many of us, there is a shift in our sense of what I am capable of. That our sense of personal strength may have actually really been, we may have learned the things that we're good at in new ways, that I can actually endure a lot more than I thought I could. If I had said to you in March, 6 months later, you will still be in lockdown, you would have said, I can't do that. And yet, we're doing that. And I actually think one of the great gifts we can give ourselves and give the teens that we work with, for those of you who are working with teens right now, is one of the most important things we can give them is a sense of the strength that they have demonstrated thus far. What have you learned about yourself that you like, that you celebrate? I think that as we careen towards the holidays, that one of the greatest gifts we could give ourselves right now is not thinking about what I'm not good at and what I need to fix, but to spend this next couple of weeks thinking about what I'm really good at and what I've really learned about myself that matters to me. Not that matters to you, but matters to me. So it may not be about my ability to get good grades if I'm an adolescent. It may actually be about my ability to reach out to other people. I've learned about myself that I can work in this medium and make people feel seen. That's a really important thing that I've learned about myself that matters to me. And instead of saying, I swore on that one video and I should not have done that, I am a terrible potty mouth. I can say to myself, I'm actually offering things that have value. And so I think that this year in particular, we have to have a parallel to our all hates. That there are things that I'm not going to beat my chest for, but I'm going to be proud of and be celebratory of. And that's the beginning of a program with teenagers, with 5-year-olds, with parents, with all of us. What have you gotten? What have you learned? What can you do? In what ways are you proud of yourself? That's a really important question for us to all be asking. I think that one of the things that we do know about reactions to adversity is people with spiritual lives, whatever that means. It's not a religious life, it's a spiritual life. People with spiritual lives actually do better. That when we, so I'm not talking about religious observance, I'm talking about a sense of there being something big in the world that matters. That spirituality actually is really helpful for us in facing adversity, processing adversity. I actually think that right now, the people who are in the most pain are rabbis and cantors and educators. And I think rabbis and cantors in particular are suffering the lack of this kind of the pinnacle of the year, which is the high holiday services. This whole season is for many rabbis and cantors the pinnacle, and they're not getting what they want. They're really, I think many of them are really suffering. We're also not getting what we expect here. We're not getting the time with other people. We're not having people come for lunch. We're not hugging and kissing in the synagogue. There's a lot of loss that is, for us, is really narrowly focused on the next 4 weeks. And I think we should be really careful to allow ourselves to feel that loss and to not beat ourselves up about it, but simply to say, this is a real loss and I miss it. Even the things I don't like about high holiday services, I miss those things. Because we are entitled to do that grieving. One of the other, another aspect of recovery from trauma has to do with our ability to use creativity to process what's happening inside us. I would suggest to you that for many of our kids, this is a great time for finger paints. It is a great time because it's messy. I think we're actually, there's just so much, that the opportunity to create something, to be creative right now is actually an opportunity to access oneself. There is, for those of you who do, who get Jewish philanthropy, there's an article in there today by a cantor named Katie Orangel, who's doing a program where she's ripping cloth and sewing it back together. That's definitely worth the read. That would be fine. My daughter is just about to walk.
I don't know what that means.
Okay.
Yes or no? Should I wait? Sorry to interrupt.
No, you should go and walk her. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
So we have now 4 more minutes. I have babbled at you incessantly. Tell me what questions you have, and then I have one more thing I want to ask you to do. Questions, thoughts, ideas, arguments. Okay, one more thing I'd like to ask you to do. I would like to ask you to think about something that you learned in the last hour, that you learned, that you thought about, that you disagree with, that something that happened in your thinking brain in the last hour that you could use. And you can either write it on a piece of paper or you can write it in the chat room. But you have to write it down, because if you don't write it down, it will not go into your brain. I am trying to glue something in your brain, and things get glued in your brain when you write them down. They actually get glued better when you write them down with pen and paper, but I'm always curious about what people have learned or taken from the last hour. So if you want to put it in the chat box, do that. Yes, unclenching and going to the dentist. What are ways to provide touch and comfort? So, Sophie, one of the things to do is to actually wish touch. To say to people, I want to touch you, I want to hug you, actually makes a difference. You can ask people to close their eyes and to experience a hug. You can say to people, I want to send you love. My granddaughters, for my husband's birthday, my daughter took big pieces of paper and traced their arms and sent him hugs. Now that's not as good as a real hug. But I think talking about the need to touch and saying I'm sending you as much love as I can. Can you feel it? Kids, we can all do that, and that actually does help. It does not address the absolute hunger for physical contact that people who are by themselves have. That is really part of how we're wired. I like doctor prescribed ice cream. I confess, I went out and bought an ice cream maker. Cuisinart makes one. It costs $80 once you have your coupon at Bed Bath & Beyond, and it has changed my life for the worse and the better. So I want you to, I'm gonna jump off of what Rabbi Perry is saying. Don't just forgive your children, forgive yourself. One of the things I think we all have to do to engage in this time is to set the bar significantly lower. Don't expect of yourself what you have expected of yourself historically. Expect something much gentler of yourself. Expect that they don't give A's at trauma. They don't give A's at crisis. Your job is to manage this and manage yourself in this, but not to get it right, because we don't get it right. So thank you so much for spending the last hour with me. And Kelly and Annie both know how to reach me. If I can be helpful in any way, please reach out to me. I think you are doing the most important work of all, which is you are holding people when they need to be held. And that both costs you and benefits you. Hold yourself as well. So Shana Tova, have a remarkable holiday season. God knows what this will feel like. And just don't expect more than you can provide. So Roz, hugs to all of you. So you stay on if you want to stay on, and enjoy each other's company.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Always so wonderful to learn from you. Shana Tova to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Feel free to stay on, I guess. I got to go do bedtime. But thank you, everybody.